Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, a couple of weeks ago we looked at the Ryzen 5 5500 and I said it's probably the minimum I'd recommend for a modern gaming PC build, this and the 3600. You may notice inconsistencies with performance in certain CPU intensive titles, but it's fine if you're looking for a low cost 6-core 12-thread option, maybe as an upgrade from a quad-core AM4 chip. Today we're looking at another CPU with the 5500 namesake, only this one costs double the money, at least from the limited supply I could find online, and it comes with a whopping 96 megabytes of L3 cache. This is the 5500 X3D, currently the most entry level of all the X3D processors, and maybe the last. But who knows. The standard 5500 from 2022 has 16 megabytes of L3 cache, is limited to PCIe 3 support and has a 65 watt TDP. It has an all-core boost clock of 4250 MHz. The X3D has 96 megabytes of L3 cache, PCIe Gen 4 support and a 105 watt TDP. It'll clock slightly lower in games at 3950 MHz. Interestingly, there was no difference between the two when it came to the DaVinci Resolve render test. Both CPUs completed the run in a respectable 37 seconds. Still, you'd be better off with a standard higher core count chip if, for example, editing and rendering videos is your main focus. With the X3D CPUs, these are very much for those interested in gaming primarily. So let's get into that. Now, comparing the 5500 non-X3D and the X3D versions may not be answering a question that a lot of people have, but I just wanted to know if spending double the money on the X3D version would get us anywhere near double the performance. Of course, it's going to depend on plenty of variables, but I have paired both chips with a 4070 Super, one of my favourite graphics cards. I'll be running at 1080p today to better highlight the performance differences between the two chips, and I've paired them with 32 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4. I'll also be using one of the cheapest AM4 boards that I own, an A320MR from Asus. This is a PCIe Gen 3 board, so there may still be extra performance left on the table when it comes to the 5500 X3D, which of course supports Gen 4. Now, first of all, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and all the footage captured today was captured directly from the 5500 X3D machine. Now, our average frame rate was 100 frames per second, with 61 as that 1% low, and 49 as our 0.1% low. So as you can see from these results and the on-screen frame time graph, gameplay was very smooth and consistent. I've put the standard 5500 results up on screen as well, and with that CPU we saw an average of 68, a 1% low of 43 and a 0.1% low of 39. So this wasn't necessarily inconsistent, but the figures were quite a bit less than that of the 5500 X3Ds here. But this isn't the biggest disparity in results that you're going to see today, not by a long shot. Let's move on to Battlefield 6, which is a perfect example of what I was just saying. Now, at 1080p with the Ultra preset and TAA, we saw 132 FPS from the Ryzen 5 5500 X3D. This is with a 1% low of 93 and a 0.1% low of 80. I'm playing on the Eastwood map here, and this is pretty CPU intensive, especially as the action starts to heat up. I'm not going to say it's necessarily the most CPU intensive title, but it's a larger map that I do really like testing with various hardware. And I've sort of devised a specific benchmark run that goes right through the middle of it, so I like to stick with it for now. With the Ryzen 5 5500, we got 81 FPS, so we're looking at like 50 frames per second less from the standard 5500 than we get with the 5500 X3D. Not only that, but our percentile numbers were also significantly reduced. We saw 58 and 45 here, down from the the aforementioned 93 and 80. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and slate the 5500 non-X3D. I've said before that I think it's sort of the minimum that you want to aim for a gaming PC build that's capable of playing everything these days, and I genuinely do think that for the money it's a perfectly viable, absolutely fine option considering the price tag. For Counter-Strike 2, well, we're seeing another huge difference here, so much so that I had to test this a few times because I didn't quite believe the results, and I'm still not 100% convinced that something isn't wrong with my 5500. Now, with the 5500 X3D, we got 321 FPS during an online game with the Dust 2 map. The 1% low was 144, and the 0.1% low was 75, so not completely immune from stutters, but this was mainly where I just got wiped out by another player and there was a brief dip with the performance. It happened once or twice. With the 5500, the standard 6-core 12-thread chip, we saw just 161 FPS. Don't get me wrong, still a very playable frame rate, especially if you have a 144Hz monitor, but there is a noticeable performance difference here, and one that can be certainly picked up even without any on-screen overlays present. The 1 and 0.1% lows were 83 and 65, so in terms of that 0.1% low, not worlds away, but when we look at the 1% figures, yeah, there is a pretty large gap between them. That said, you pair the 5500 with something like a 3060 and you're going to have a pretty decent and fairly well balanced time in a lot of games. For Crimson Desert, another pretty CPU intensive title here at the Ultra preset with 1080p resolution. Of course, we saw 96 FPS from our 5500 X3D and 4070 Super combination. The 1% low was 58 and the 0.1% low was 47. Now we're still going to see a few little dips and drops as we make our way to those more processor intensive areas like cities and villages. You may notice a few dips on screen here, but that said, it held up fairly well and it didn't drop as much as I was anticipating. The same cannot be said for the standard 5500, which still did okay, 68 FPS on average, but as you can see we are leaving a lot of performance on the table by using this weaker CPU. The 1% low was 41 and the 0.1% low was 35. To be completely honest with you though, I was expecting a few more drops from this, so it held its own fairly well again when you consider the price too. For GTA 5 Enhanced, we have the maximum RT preset here with the 5500 X3D. We are seeing 113 FPS, a 1% low of 86 and a 0.1% low of 72. Very smooth overall. The standard 5500 hit just 67 frames per second, a 1% low of 52 and a 0.1% low of 42. So figures across the board were noticeably lower here. That said, with both chips at this resolution, with the 4070 Super, we are still going to see a bottleneck, not just with the 5500 but with the 5500 X3D as well in certain cases. This is still going to hold our graphics card back at this resolution, but the reason I test at 1080p is because it shows a bigger difference between the chips, and I don't think it's too unrealistic either to play at this res with this card in 2026. Nor do I think pairing a 5500 X3D with a 4070 Super is completely unrealistic either. I like to try and maintain some level of potential real world scenarios, trying to find a balance basically between that and hardware that can actually show you the difference between processors. I hope I've done that. For Resident Evil Requiem at 1080p, of course with the maximum preset and TAA, we saw 144 FPS from the 5500 X3D and its whopping 96 megabytes of L3 cache. The 1% low was 96 and the 0.1% low was a very nice 69. This is an outdoor area, so slightly more intensive for our system. The frame rate will pick up quite significantly indoors. With the 5500, again a pretty solid result of 94 frames per second with a 1% low of 66 and a 0.1% low of 58. Our penultimate game is Red Dead Redemption 2, ran absolutely lovely on the 5500 X3D, 142 FPS. That said, areas like Valentine and Saint Denis will still put a little bit of strain on this 6-core 12-thread chip, with dips to the percentile lows as we can see here. These were 95 and 87. That said, a very consistent overall result for this processor here. And I think honestly the same can be said for the 5500, though we may notice a little bit more CPU utilization. This is going to struggle a bit more here, especially in those busier NPC populated zones. 99 FPS overall, a 1% low of 72 and a 0.1% low of 65, so still plus 60 FPS across the board from the cheaper chip. Not bad at all. Arc Raiders 2 finalised then, a massive 151 FPS from the X3D CPU. That 1% low was 92 and the 0.1% low was 49, so not completely immune from drops and stutters, especially when wandering around through the woodlands and forests and the little towns that are scattered all over the map here. The 5500 put up a pretty solid effort, 91 frames per second, a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 42, so more prone to drops below 60 FPS, but overall it was okay. Overall, there is a clear difference with the X3D CPU, which I think was to be expected. The 5500 non-X3D is of course very similar to a 3600, and I think if you had one of these, or indeed the 5500, then the X3D version would make a nice upgrade to it. So upgrading from a 5500 to another 5500, albeit the X3D version of the chip, would be a pretty good path to go down, I think, especially if you don't want to upgrade to AM5 because of motherboard and RAM prices. Yeah, you're going to notice a huge difference, particularly if you have a mid-range or higher end GPU. If you're using something more entry-level, more budget-friendly, let's say at the lower end of the spectrum, perhaps a 1660 for example, then I don't think you're going to benefit all that much. You will probably still see improvements to the percentile low, so perhaps smoother gameplay. But if you're still rocking AM4, you want one last hurrah from that setup of yours, then the 5500 X3D is a very nice choice indeed. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, it's always worth considering alternatives, and it's worth seeing what other processors exist either on the new or used market and how close they sit to this 5500 X3D. As for this one then, thanks again, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.